Hello and welcome to Creepy Raindrops. Before you drift off to sleep, let me tell you a story that will help you relax and fall into a deep, peaceful slumber. Sit or lie down comfortably and let the world around you slowly fade away. Tonight, I will take you on a journey through the woods, where the air is cool and the shadows of the trees stretch long. As you listen, let your mind relax, your body feel heavy, and all the noise in your head gradually fade away. Before we begin, I'd like to know, which city are you listening to this story from? And what time is it there? Creepy Road Trip, a California driver's encounter with the paranormal. It was a warm summer evening, sometime in late August, when Sarah Thompson, a 32-year-old freelance photographer from Los Angeles, decided to take a solo road trip up the Pacific Coast Highway. She had been feeling the weight of her hectic work schedule and needed a break, so she packed her car, grabbed her camera, and hit the road. As dusk settled over the coastline, the soft hum of her engine seemed to blend with the crashing waves in the distance. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue across the sky. Everything was peaceful. Too peaceful, Sarah thought, as she cruised along the winding road. By the time she reached the town of Carmel by the sea, the last traces of daylight had disappeared, leaving only the moonlight to illuminate the road. Sarah pulled off at a small, deserted gas station to stretch her legs. The place had an eerie, almost abandoned feel to it, with flickering fluorescent lights and a faint smell of stale gasoline in the air. She stepped out of her car, the sound of the ocean waves crashing in the distance. The wind felt unusually cold for a summer evening, and it sent a chill down her spine. After a brief pause, she decided to continue her journey, but as she was about to get back into her car, she noticed something strange in the rearview mirror. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but the longer she stared, the more convinced she became. A figure, a woman, was standing at the edge of the gas station, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light. Sarah couldn't see her face, but something about the woman's posture seemed off. She was standing perfectly still, just staring ahead into the darkness. Shivers ran down Sarah's spine, but she convinced herself it was just a local waiting for a ride. She started the car and pulled away, hoping the strange sight would fade from her mind. However, as Sarah continued driving, things only grew stranger. The night grew darker, and the road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, with no signs of civilization in sight. It wasn't long before she noticed something else, a car in the distance following her at a steady pace. At first, she thought it was just another traveler, but the more she watched, the more uneasy she felt. The headlights of the car seemed oddly dim, like they were purposely keeping their distance. And no matter how fast she drove, the car stayed right behind her, never speeding up, never slowing down. Then, it happened. The car suddenly sped up, pulling up next to her on the winding road. Sarah glanced over, expecting to see another driver, but what she saw made her heart race in terror. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel as the car pulled closer. Her heart began to race, and a feeling of unease spread through her. The car beside her seemed to move unnaturally, staying in perfect alignment with hers, but there was no driver behind the wheel. She glanced over again, this time trying to focus on the vehicle more carefully. The faint light from her dashboard illuminated a figure in the passenger seat, an eerie, pale woman, her face obscured by long, dark hair that flowed wildly as if blown by the wind. The figure was completely still, staring straight ahead. Panic surged within Sarah as she tried to process what she was seeing. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and she forced herself to look back at the road. She couldn't focus on the woman. Not now. Her mind was racing, and her instincts screamed at her to get away. But the car, that ghostly figure sitting inside it, kept pace with her, never once veering off or slowing down. She stepped on the gas, speeding up, hoping to lose the strange car behind her. But no matter how fast she went, the vehicle stayed beside her, perfectly matching her speed. The wind howled outside, and Sarah felt a sudden coldness creeping into the car, even though the night had been warm just moments ago. She swerved left to avoid a sharp turn,
but the ghostly car followed her with no hesitation. Fear was consuming her. What was going on? She could hardly breathe, let alone think straight. She glanced into the rearview mirror again, but to her shock, the car that had been chasing her had disappeared. For a moment, Sarah thought she had imagined the whole thing. Her pulse was still pounding in her ears, but she tried to convince herself it was just stress from the long drive. Maybe she was just seeing things, or the fatigue had begun to take its toll. But as she came to a sharp curve in the road, her headlights illuminated something ahead. A figure, standing alone in the middle of the highway. It was the same woman she had seen earlier, standing at the gas station. The same pale face, the same wild hair, but now her eyes were open wide, staring straight at Sarah with an intensity that seemed to pierce through her very soul. The woman didn't move, didn't even flinch as Sarah slammed on the brakes, desperately trying to avoid a collision. But the car felt as though it were moving in slow motion, and before she could react, she saw the woman's figure grow larger and larger, impossibly close. Just as the headlights of the car were about to meet the woman's figure, Sarah swerved the wheel sharply to the left, sending her car careening off the road. She could feel the wheels scraping against the gravel as the car bounced violently, but somehow she managed to regain control. Her car came to a halt at the edge of the cliffside, with nothing but darkness and a sheer drop ahead of her. Breathing heavily, Sarah sat frozen in her seat, her heart racing. She could feel the cold sweat beating on her skin, and she was shaking uncontrollably. The silence around her was deafening. Her mind was a blur, trying to make sense of what had just happened. There was no sign of the woman, no strange car, no trace of anything supernatural. But the fear, real, raw, and suffocating, still lingered in the air. It felt as if something was watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. After several long moments, Sarah gathered the strength to take a deep breath. She turned the ignition back on and slowly drove back onto the highway, her hands trembling. As she passed the curve, she glanced out of the corner of her eye, half expecting to see the woman again. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the dark stretch of highway ahead. Still rattled, Sarah tried to steady her nerves. Maybe it was a hallucination, she thought. Maybe it was just the stress. But deep down, she knew that something had happened, something beyond explanation. She had driven these roads countless times, but she had never felt such an overpowering presence before. She kept her speed slow, trying to calm herself, but the strange feeling didn't leave. The road seemed endless now, stretching on and on with no signs of civilization in sight. The silence in the car felt almost oppressive, and Sarah couldn't shake the sense that something was following her. Minutes passed, maybe hours, it was hard to tell, but the landscape around her grew more desolate. There were no other cars, no street lights, just the occasional curve in the road and the whisper of wind against her car. As she approached a particularly sharp bend, Sarah spotted something up ahead, barely visible in the distance. She squinted, trying to make out what it was. At first, she thought it was another car, parked by the side of the road. But as she drew closer, she saw that it was something far more disturbing. A figure, standing alone on the edge of the highway, just as the woman had before. But this time, the figure was not stationary. It was moving toward her. Sarah slammed her foot down on the brakes, her pulse pounding in her ears again. She wasn't sure what to do. It was too late to turn around, and she couldn't stop herself from inching closer to the figure. The headlights illuminated the scene, and as she drew near, the figure finally came into focus. It was a man this time, wearing old-fashioned clothing, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes locked onto hers through the windshield, and an overwhelming chill swept through the car, freezing Sarah in place. There was no expression on his face, but his gaze was intense, almost predatory. His lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile, and then, without warning, he began walking toward the car. Heart racing, Sarah frantically looked around for an escape route. There was no way around him. She was trapped on this narrow, desolate stretch of road with no other cars in sight. Her breath hitched as the figure drew closer, his gait slow but deliberate, like he knew exactly what he was doing. The car's engine sputtered, and for a terrifying moment, Sarah thought it might stall entirely. The lights flickered as she held her breath, her hand still gripped tightly on the wheel. And then, just as the man was almost at her door, he stopped. He tilted his head slightly, as if studying her, before turning around abruptly and walking off into the darkness. Sarah could hardly believe her eyes. What had just happened? What had she seen? Her mind raced, but the answer remained elusive. The figure disappeared into the night, and the eerie silence returned, leaving her alone on that isolated stretch of highway. Shaking, Sarah didn't wait for another second. She stepped on the gas and sped off, desperate to leave whatever was haunting her behind. But deep in her gut, she knew that the strange, ghostly events weren't over. Something had followed her, something ancient, something that would never let her forget the terror of that night. As she drove on into the night, the darkness seemed to close in around her, and she couldn't help but wonder, was she truly alone on these lonely roads, or was something, or someone, waiting for her in the shadows? The road ahead was still long. The horror was far from over. Sarah's hands trembled as she pressed the gas pedal, pushing her car down the lonely road. The fear gnawing at her stomach seemed to intensify with every mile she traveled. Her eyes darted between the rearview mirror and the winding road ahead, searching for any signs of movement. But the highway remained deserted, save for the occasional flicker of her headlights illuminating the darkened trees on either side. The air had become suffocating, thick with the tension of the night. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that something unseen was following her every move. Every curve in the road seemed to take longer to navigate, every shadow stretching farther than it should. She tried to focus on the road, telling herself that she was just exhausted, that the dark and the isolation were playing tricks on her mind. But deep down, she knew better. The presence, whatever it was, had not left her. The car's engine hummed quietly beneath her, but the silence that enveloped her felt like a heavy weight. It wasn't the peaceful quiet she had once found comforting during her long drives. It was the kind of silence that made your skin crawl, as though the world itself had become still and unwelcoming. Just as Sarah's grip on the wheel tightened, she saw something up ahead. A light. At first it looked like a car's headlights, but as she neared, she realized it was coming from an old weathered sign on the side of the road. She squinted, trying to read it. The sign read, Carmel Valley, 15 miles. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had been so lost in the haze of her fear that she hadn't realized she was heading back toward the town she had passed earlier. She remembered the gas station, the woman standing there, her strange presence still haunting her. But that was hours ago, and she hadn't expected to see this sign now. It didn't make sense. Still, something in her mind clicked. The sense of dread that had been following her since she left Carmel by the sea began to pulse with urgency. She couldn't go back there. Not now. Not after what had happened. Before she could process the thought, her headlights flickered. Once. Twice. And then the car stalled. Her breath caught in her throat as the engine sputtered and died, leaving her in complete darkness. The dashboard went black, and the sound of the wind against the car was the only thing that filled the silence. Panic gripped Sarah's chest. She tried turning the key again, but the engine refused to start. Her hands shook as she twisted the key over and over, but nothing happened. The car was dead. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she sat in the eerie stillness. She knew she couldn't just sit there, not with whatever force was out there lurking in the shadows. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to open the door and step out of the car, her heart pounding in her ears. The cold night air hit her instantly, sending a shiver down her spine. She looked around, her eyes scanning the darkness, but she saw nothing. There was no sign of movement, no sounds except the wind, which had picked up slightly, whistling through the trees. Sarah's thoughts raced. Should she try to walk to Carmel Valley? It was 15 miles away, and walking alone at night in the middle of nowhere wasn't an option she relished. But before she could decide, a faint sound caught her attention, something just beyond the trees. A whisper, barely audible, but enough to send a jolt of fear through her. She stiffened, her body tensing, and then she heard it again. This time it was clearer. A voice, low and guttural, as though it were speaking from the depths of the earth. Sarah turned in the direction of the sound, her eyes wide with fear. There was nothing but the endless stretch of road, the trees that loomed like silent sentinels on either side, and the darkness beyond. The voice grew louder, and now it was unmistakable. It was calling her name. Sarah. The sound was unmistakable, and it made her stomach drop. It was as if the voice was coming from inside her own mind, an echo that she couldn't escape. She felt her knees weaken, and for a moment she thought she might collapse right there in the middle of the road. But she couldn't stay here. Not with that voice. Not with whatever was watching her from the shadows. Turning quickly, she scrambled back into the car, her heart racing. She slammed the door shut and locked it, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Her eyes darted around the inside of the car, searching for anything that might make her feel safe, but it all felt wrong. The darkness outside pressed in on her, suffocating. And then the voice came again, louder this time, unmistakable, as if it was right outside the car. Sarah. It was followed by a soft tapping on the window. Her blood ran cold. Slowly, Sarah turned her head, her breath caught in her throat. She didn't want to look. She didn't want to see what was on the other side of that window, but she couldn't resist. She forced herself to look. At first, there was nothing, just the reflection of the car's interior, the headlights illuminating the empty road ahead. But then she saw it. A figure, just behind the glass, standing there in the darkness. It was the woman from before, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide and hollow. The hair that had once been wild now hung in strands, matted and tangled. And the smile on her face, it wasn't a friendly smile. It was twisted, filled with malice, as though the woman knew something Sarah didn't, something terrible. Sarah's body froze, her hands clenched around the steering wheel and her eyes locked onto the figure outside the window. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. The woman's gaze never wavered, never blinked, as though she had all the time in the world. The tapping came again, this time louder, more insistent. Sarah's mind screamed at her to drive, to get out of there, but her body wouldn't obey. It was as though something was holding her in place, paralyzed by fear. The woman's lips parted, and for the briefest moment, Sarah thought she heard words, whispers carried by the wind. "You should have stayed," the voice said. "Now you're mine." The words echoed in Sarah's mind, and in that moment she felt a cold hand close around her heart, squeezing the life out of her. She had no way of knowing if the voice had come from the woman outside the car or from something much darker. But the terror she felt was real. Suddenly, the headlights of another car appeared in the distance, shining through the trees. The figure outside the window disappeared instantly, fading into the shadows, as if it had never been there at all. Sarah's body jerked into motion as she slammed her foot on the gas pedal, the car roaring to life as if the world had returned to normal. The headlights of the approaching vehicle grew closer, but she didn't care. She had to leave. She had to get away from that place, away from the nightmare that had followed her all the way from Carmel by the sea. As the car sped down the highway, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that something was still out there, waiting for her to slip up. She drove faster, past the sign for Carmel Valley, past the darkness, until there was nothing but the hum of the engine and the road ahead. But deep in her soul she knew, the woman in the dark, the whispers in the night, they weren't just figments of her imagination. She had crossed into a world she didn't understand, and she couldn't escape the horror that lurked on California's lonely roads. Sarah's hands were shaking as she gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white. The car's engine hummed steadily beneath her, but it felt like nothing could drown out the pounding in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare wasn't over, even though the figure outside the window had disappeared. It was as though the encounter had left an imprint on her, a mark she couldn't wash away. She glanced nervously in the rearview mirror. The road behind her was empty, just a long stretch of asphalt. the occasional blur of trees passing by in the headlights. No other vehicles, no figures, no signs of movement. But the silence, the emptiness, only made her feel more isolated, more vulnerable. She pressed her foot a little harder on the gas pedal, as if trying to outrun her fear. But the more she drove, the more the air seemed to grow heavy, oppressive, like the weight of a storm about to break. The darkness outside pressed in on her, and every shadow along the roadside seemed to take on a life of its own. Every rustle of leaves in the wind, every distant creak of the car's suspension made her jump. Her mind kept replaying the events from earlier. The voice, the woman outside her window. How had it all happened? Was she going crazy? Or was something truly following her, waiting for the right moment to claim her? She couldn't answer that. What she did know was that she felt the chill in her bones, the sense that whatever it was that had haunted her on this road wasn't something she could easily escape. As the road stretched on, Sarah began to notice that the scenery seemed to change. It was subtle at first, just the landscape around her appearing more desolate, more barren. The trees on either side of the road grew sparse, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The asphalt beneath her tires began to crack, the smooth surface now littered with small rocks and debris. It was like the road itself was deteriorating. And then she saw it. At first it looked like a mirage, a faint light ahead in the distance. But as she got closer, her eyes widened in disbelief. A small, isolated house sat by the side of the road, bathed in an eerie, almost unnatural glow. It was a quaint structure, with white siding and a porch, but it looked abandoned, like no one had lived there in years. Its windows were dark, but somehow the faint light seemed to emanate from inside, casting long shadows that danced across the overgrown lawn. Sarah slowed the car as she passed, her gaze drawn to the house, but something stopped her from looking away. A shape. A figure standing in front of the house just outside the door. It was a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a shadowed face. He was standing perfectly still, staring directly at her as she drove by. She didn't want to stop. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't help herself. Her eyes locked onto his, and she felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. The figure didn't move, didn't react in any way. But his gaze was intense, as though he was trying to convey something without words. Before she could process what was happening, she found herself looking at the rearview mirror. And there he was again. The figure, now standing at the edge of the road, watching her as she sped away. The same empty stare, the same ominous stillness. Her heart raced again, and she slammed her foot down on the gas pedal, pushing the car to go faster, desperate to put more distance between herself and the figure. But the further she drove, the more the sense of dread grew. It was as if the very air around her had thickened, as if the road had become a prison. No matter how fast she went, no matter how far she drove, the feeling that something was closing in on her didn't go away. It only intensified. Suddenly the car lurched. The tires screeched in protest as the steering wheel jerked to the side. Sarah's eyes shot to the road ahead, and in the distance she saw something that made her blood run cold. A figure was standing right in the middle of the road. She didn't know how it had gotten there. There was no time to react, no time to slow down. The headlights illuminated the figure, a man, dressed in tattered clothes, his back turned to her. The same man from the house. Sarah slammed on the brakes, but the car slid, its tires unable to grip the cracked pavement. The figure didn't budge, didn't move at all. It was as though he was waiting for her, expecting her to stop, expecting her to approach. The car came to a screeching halt just inches from the man, the sound of the tires grinding against the road filling the air. Sarah's breath was ragged, her hands shaking violently on the wheel. She didn't know what to do. She couldn't go forward, and she certainly couldn't reverse. He was blocking her every exit. The figure slowly turned around, his face hidden in shadow, his eyes glowing faintly under the dim light. His mouth didn't move, but Sarah could hear the voice again, that same whisper from before. "You shouldn't have come back." The words echoed in her mind, sending a wave of terror through her entire body. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't speak. Her heart thudded in her chest, threatening to burst out of her ribcage. The man didn't take a step toward her. Instead, he just stood there, watching her, as if he was waiting for something. And then, as if on cue, the temperature in the car plummeted. The air became unbearably cold and Sarah's breath fogged up the windshield. She turned her head quickly, hoping to see another car approaching, but the road remained empty. There was no one, just the man, standing motionless in front of her, his glowing eyes never leaving hers. She realized then, he wasn't just standing there. He was waiting for her to make a choice. Her fingers trembled on the gear shift. She couldn't stay here. She had to go. She had to get away, but how? What was she supposed to do? Before she could act, the man raised a hand slowly, pointing directly at her, his finger trembling. His lips parted, and his voice, now clearer, more intense, filled the car. "You're mine now." The words resonated deep within her chest, the force of them shaking her to her core. Sarah felt a sharp jolt in her stomach, and then the car lurched forward again, as though it had been pushed by an unseen force. She had no control over the steering wheel. Her vision blurred, the world around her spinning as the car surged down the road, moving faster than she had ever driven before. Panic-stricken, Sarah tried to fight the pull, tried to regain control, but it was futile. The road ahead stretched endlessly, the car speeding faster and faster, as if the very pavement itself was forcing her to keep moving forward. And all the while, she could hear the whisper of the man's voice echoing in the background. "You're never leaving." The words blurred into a haunting melody that danced around her ears as the world outside the car turned into nothing but dark shapes and shadows, closing in, pulling her deeper into the abyss. Sarah's grip on the wheel was frantic, her knuckles pale and stiff as the car surged down the desolate road. The engine roared, but it felt like a distant sound, like it was coming from somewhere far away, as though she was no longer in control of the vehicle. Her eyes darted from the rearview mirror to the road ahead, but all she could see was darkness. The headlights barely cut through the blackness, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly before her. Every mile felt like an eternity, every second weighed down by the oppressive silence that had descended on her. She tried to steady her breathing, but the panic surged within her chest like a tidal wave. The man, the figure from the house, the one who had blocked her path, was still there, haunting her. She could hear his voice in her mind, his words repeating over and over, "You're never leaving." The sound of it echoed in her ears as though it was etched into her very soul, a curse that she couldn't escape. The night was thick, and the car seemed to be moving faster than it should, as though it had taken on a life of its own. Sarah had no control. She had tried to brake, to slow down, but the pedal had refused to respond. It was as though the vehicle was being propelled forward by something more powerful than her will. The force pressed her back into her seat, her heart racing as the world outside blurred past her. Her eyes flicked to the dashboard. Everything seemed to be malfunctioning. The fuel gauge was spinning wildly, the radio crackling with static. But it was the speedometer that caught her attention. The needle was climbing, pushing toward dangerous levels. She tried to force her foot onto the brake again, but it was no use. The car wasn't slowing down. The road had changed. The cracked asphalt was gone now, replaced by an older, more rugged path, dirt and rocks that jutted up from the earth. The car jolted with every bump, but it didn't slow. If anything, it seemed to move faster, eating up the miles, as if the very road was urging her to go faster, to push harder. Sarah's grip on the wheel was frantic, her knuckles pale and stiff as the car surged down the desolate road. The engine roared, but it felt like a distant sound, like it was coming from somewhere far away, as though she was no longer in control of the vehicle. Her eyes darted from the rearview mirror to the road ahead, but all she could see was darkness. The headlights barely cut through the blackness, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly before her. Every mile felt like an eternity, every second weighed down by the oppressive silence that had descended on her. She tried to steady her breathing, but the panic surged within her chest like a tidal wave. The man, the figure from the house, the one who had blocked her path, was still there, haunting her. She could hear his voice in her mind, his words repeating over and over, "You're never leaving." The sound of it echoed in her ears, as though it was etched into her very soul, a curse that she couldn't escape. The night was thick, and the car seemed to be moving faster than it should, as though it had taken on a life of its own. Sarah had no control. She had tried to brake, to slow down, but the pedal had refused to respond. It was as though the vehicle was being propelled forward by something more powerful than her will. The force pressed her back into her seat, her heart racing as the world outside blurred past her. Her eyes flicked to the dashboard. Everything seemed to be malfunctioning. The fuel gauge was spinning wildly, the radio crackling with static. But it was the speedometer that caught her attention. The needle was climbing, pushing toward dangerous levels. She tried to force her foot onto the brake again, but it was no use. The car wasn't slowing down. The road had changed. The cracked asphalt was gone now, replaced by an older, more rugged path, dirt and rocks that jutted up from the earth. The car jolted with every bump, but it didn't slow. If anything, it seemed to move faster, eating up the miles as if the very road was urging her to go faster, to push harder. The trees on either side of the road were no longer trees at all. They were twisted shapes, long, spindly limbs that reached out like the hands of some ancient creature, their gnarled branches clawing at the air. The wind howled through the leaves, but it didn't sound natural. It sounded like a whisper, like a voice calling her name, faint and distorted. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps, and she squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, trying to block out the rising panic. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself. "You're just tired. You're seeing things." But deep down, she knew she wasn't. Whatever was happening was real. The man in the middle of the road, the strange force propelling the car forward. It wasn't her imagination. This wasn't just a bad dream. She was trapped in something much darker than she could comprehend. The headlights flickered again, and in that moment, the darkness ahead of her seemed to part. There in the distance she saw it, a faint glow like a distant campfire. For a moment Sarah thought it was another car, someone who could help her, someone who could pull her out of this nightmare. She clung to the hope like a lifeline, her eyes locked on the light as the car surged forward, faster and faster. But as she neared, her stomach twisted. The glow wasn't a campfire or a car. It was the same light she had seen earlier, the light that had come from the old house by the side of the road. The house she had driven past moments ago. But this time, the light was different. It pulsed, like a heartbeat, and the ground around it seemed to shimmer as though reality itself was bending, warping in on itself. Her pulse quickened as the car pushed toward the strange light. She tried to turn the wheel, to steer away, but it was useless. The car followed the path like it had been bound to it, as though the very earth beneath her tires was pulling her in. She tried again to press the brake, but her foot might as well have been pressing on a stone. The car wouldn't stop. It wasn't until she was almost upon the light that the world around her seemed to shift. The glow intensified, and Sarah had to squint against the brightness, though it wasn't painful. It was almost inviting, like a warm embrace, pulling her closer. The road ahead dissolved, and she found herself staring at a vast empty field. It was a meadow of sorts, but everything was wrong. The colors were muted, washed out, as though someone had drained all the life from the world around her. The grass was too still, the trees too quiet. Even the sky above had a strange, grayish tint to it. It was the kind of place you would see in a dream, or maybe a nightmare. The car came to a sudden halt. The engine died, and for a moment there was complete silence. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, and she held her breath, not daring to make a sound. The eerie stillness around her pressed in, suffocating. She slowly looked out the window. And then she saw it. A figure in the distance standing in the middle of the field. The same man. His figure was no longer a shadow, no longer distant. He was standing tall, facing her now, his features clearer, more defined. But there was something wrong about him. His skin was pale, almost ashen, and his eyes were black, like deep wells of darkness, reflecting nothing but void. The moment their eyes met, Sarah's body went cold. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't. She couldn't move. The man's presence seemed to press down on her, suffocating her, as if his very existence had the power to drain the life from her. He took a step forward, then another and another. Each step brought him closer to the car. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace, his gaze never leaving hers, as if he was watching her every reaction, every breath. The wind picked up again, but it wasn't natural. The gusts howled like distant voices, like a chorus of whispers, growing louder with every second. The voices, were they real? Were they coming from the man, or from somewhere else? Sarah. The whisper echoed in her mind again, and this time it was clear, like a cold, sharp blade cutting through her thoughts. Sarah, you shouldn't have come here. The man's voice wasn't like before. It was deep, guttural, filled with an unnatural force. Sarah's body trembled. Her hands gripped the wheel, but she couldn't bring herself to move. You never should have come back, he continued, his words carrying a weight that seemed to press down on her chest. This is where you belong now. The world around her seemed to tilt, as if the very earth had begun to warp beneath her feet. The sky, the trees, even the car, all of it was beginning to shift, to blur, like the edges of a fading dream. She couldn't make sense of it. None of it made sense. But the one thing she understood was that she wasn't alone. Her heart raced as the man drew closer. His hand, outstretched now, reached for the door of the car. Sarah's breath hitched as she realized there was no escape. The door wouldn't open. The windows were sealed tight, and the air inside the car had become suffocating. It was as though the very car itself had become a prison, holding her captive. And the man, he was coming closer, his hand almost upon her, and then, with a sudden force, the window shattered. The sound of glass breaking was deafening, echoing through the silent field. Sarah screamed, her body jerking back as a cold, skeletal hand reached through the broken window and seized her arm. The grip was like ice, freezing her to the bone, pulling her closer to the figure outside. In that moment, the world fell away. There was no more car, no more road. There was nothing but the darkness, the cold, and the whispering voices. Come with me, the man's voice echoed, his breath cold against her ear. You belong here, in the dark, with us. And then, everything went black. The last thing Sarah heard before she lost consciousness was the man's voice, distant yet clear in her mind. You're mine now. As Sarah's consciousness faded, she was pulled into the darkness, her body unable to resist the icy grip of the man. The cold wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket, pulling her deeper into the unknown. The whispers grew louder, overwhelming her thoughts, until they consumed her entirely. When she awoke, there was no more road, no more car, no more world she had once known. The endless field stretched before her, bathed in an eerie twilight. The man stood in front of her, his black eyes glowing with an unholy light. She had no words, no fight left. She was no longer Sarah. She was something else, something lost, bound forever to the darkness. Her final scream was swallowed by the void. Thank you for listening to this spine-chilling tale. We hope it kept you on the edge of your seat. Now, as you drift off to sleep, may your dreams be sweet and free from shadows. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss out on our next terrifying story. Sleep well, and may you always find the light even in the darkest of places.